Welcome. This is the Punk CX podcast. My name is Adrian Swinscoe, and I'm an advisor, best-selling author, Forbes contributor, and general explorer of the service and experience space. On the podcast, I seek out and interview entrepreneurs, leading business people, authors, tech leaders, academics, and generally cool people doing interesting stuff in the service and experience space. Check out the archive at adrianswinscoe.com. That's enough from me. Let's get into the interview. So welcome to the next edition of the Punk CX podcast. With me today, I have Deborah, or more commonly known as Deb Battaglia, who is the SVP of Customer Experience at Assurant, which is a global, let me get this right, B2B2C Fortune 300 company that provides risk management and insurance products to leading automotive, housing, and mobile technology companies, no less.
Absolutely.
Deb, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing?
Thanks for having me. I'm doing well. Excited to be here.
Excellent. No, well, thank you. So, Deb, for the benefit of our listeners and also folks that read the highlights of the podcast that I produce, can you give us a bit of a thumbnail sketch on you and the work that you do?
Sure. Yeah. So, you articulated what Assurant is. And, a lot of people don't necessarily know who we are. We don't have a whole lot of name recognition, but that's because we have a very, very diversified product portfolio. Mm-hmm. You mentioned the world's leading companies, right? So we work directly with a lot of those consumer companies. We currently serve 15 of the top 50 most valuable brands in the world. And what we do is we protect and enhance their brand by offering and fulfilling kind of these embedded products, right?
Okay.
So
is that like the things like warranties and all that type of stuff?
Exactly. Yeah. Okay. From telecommunications, housing, automotive, retail. So largely insurance products where, so if you have your cell phone, right, with a provider, we may insure the handset. Or if you bought a car at a dealership, maybe we're providing the extended warranty or the service contract, right? Right. Renters insurance, homeowners insurance, just this really, really wide swath of products. And we deliver that on behalf of the clients, sometimes white labeled, sometimes not. Mm-hmm. And we have over 300 million customers around the world. So what I do personally is I lead the global team that makes sure that the experiences those 300 million customers have with Assurant are world-class in quality, right? So I lead customer experience. We have practitioners across the globe, and they're dedicated to making sure that those experiences are as good as they can be.
Wow. Cool. That's great. Now, the thing I was, when we got put in touch, I'm always interested and excited to hear stories about firms that have made big changes to how they serve their customers. And I'll put it out there right now. There's not that many kind of brands that are really, in my experience, that are really comfortable publicly speaking about what they're doing and what they're up to. So thank you for coming on the podcast and sharing it, being willing to share your story. So as I was saying, that I'm really interested in hearing stories about firms that have made big changes to how they serve their customers, and particularly those in sectors and there are companies that we would deem to be, in air quotes, traditional, that have been around for a long time, that are not digitally native, as it were, that they've had to take on this and do some heavy lifting. So I wanted to ask you to kick us off so can you give us a bit of an intro to kind of Assurant and also the why and vision for this transformational journey that you've been going on, which you told me about on the lead up to the podcast?
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting because, you talked about Assurant being traditional, right? Air quotes traditional. And it's interesting because even though we have 100+ year history, we are actually one of those rare companies that continually reinvents ourselves, right? So we've reinvented ourselves time and time and time again over the years, just by modifying our offerings, right? Mm-hmm. If the market needs are changing, or our clients and consumers are changing and their desires are changing, then we shift what we're offering and how we're offering it. So a lot of times that was through mergers or acquisitions. It could happen, internally, organically, just through shifts of how we offer things, sometimes through divestiture. Right. But at our heart, like you said, we've always been kind of this B2B2C company, meaning we work directly with clients, and then those products that we embed with the clients are offered to end consumers. But that means that over the majority of those 100 years, right, we've really been maniacally focused on the clients, which that was for good reason. That's where our kind of revenue streams come from, right? But over the last decade or so, just it became really apparent that in a very highly commoditized financial services market, right? So you think about insurance, you think about fee-based services. Lots of people offer those, right? So how do you set yourself apart? Well, where we had an opportunity to differentiate ourselves was through the experience we were providing to end consumers. So that's what we did. We really doubled down. We invested in. We built a center of excellence, and then we established our vision. And so my CX vision for Assurant and for my team is that across Assurant, we are customer obsessed, and that our passion drives us to deliver differentiated experiences supported by purposeful design and execution. Right. So there's a lot in there as any vision, but you asked about the vision, right?
Yeah.
And that's North Star. That everybody at Assurant knows how to bring the right tools to the job in order to purposefully design experiences. Experiences don't happen by accident. I mean, they do, but they might not be the ones you intended to deliver, right? So purposefully designed and executed in a great way. So
can I dig into the kind of the purposeful kind of bit, because that's a really interesting kind of like word, and can I ask you to explain kind of what do you mean by purposeful design?
So what we mean by purposeful design is that most companies have, you're in business to make money, right? So all companies are in business to make money. You wouldn't exist otherwise. But usually that's the first lens that a company brings to building something that's going to touch the customer. Right. What is my goal as an organization? How do I optimize, that process from an internal perspective? And what is it that I need for the customer to do in order to purchase or interact with my products, right? We look at it from an internal business lens. Everybody does. That's human nature. But taking a purposeful approach to designing experiences means stepping out of that shoe and out of that lens as the business person and stepping into the customer's shoes and saying, what are they going through? What's happening in their life that even requires that they're going to need something from us? And so your starting point becomes, what does the customer need, not what does the business need? And that's what I mean by purposeful design is that you're on purpose. You're first starting with where the customer is and then building what they need rather than building what you want to sell.
Yeah,
which is
that makes sense.
What a lot of companies do, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that's the thing. But then I guess you've got it's crucial to align that with corporate objectives and business outcomes and all that sort of stuff.
Right. Yeah. And it's the convergence of those viewpoints that's where the magic is, right? So it's not that you abandon your internal viewpoint. That's always going to be there.
Well, that's crazy.
But you do have to get to the point where you're matching it up with that outside in perspective and saying, what are the emotions? What are the real world things that this customer is going through? Why do they need to interact with our customers or with our business? And then how can we meet them where they are? And that's the magic. And the further up the whatever you want to call it, the value chain or the sales cycle, the further up the product life cycle you start that process. If you started at inception of designing a product or service for the market, then you're going to have much more success, right? You can take that lens and improve a product or service that's already in market. You can reduce pain points, you can reduce touch points. But if you start from the very beginning in designing what that offering even is, then your chances for success are wildly greater.
Yeah, no, and the reason I asked about the vision and the why behind it is because it's in my conversations and research and a sort of a advisory kind of like work is that what I find, commonly find is that many companies don't really have great clarity on the vision that they of what kind of don't necessarily have great clarity on where they are currently. I don't have great, even better clarity on where they want to be.
Right.
And then that kind of tends to kind of hobble their ability to be able to articulate a strategy to be able to help them figure out kind of how we're going to get from A to B.
Yep.
And then the next step is then how do I make that make sense for both the enablement and the support and the fulfillment of corporate and business objectives?
Yes.
And and ROI then cascades out of that sort of thing, and that becomes that's a perennial problem that that pervades the experience industry. That's kind of one of the things I wanted to. That's why I wanted to start with the vision question. But then, if I go back to that, you got that kind of vision. I mean, you talked about, 300 million end consumers. That's not clients. That's end consumers. That's across that portfolio. I mean, where did you start? And how long have you been at this? Because it's a bit like going, that feels like it's a big hill to climb.
It is. Yeah. It's a big remit, right? So yeah, I've been in my role coming up on 4 years now. The nice thing is, because you just articulated it perfectly, like the process you have to go through, right? Documenting current state, identifying target state, what are the gaps in between, right? What's the ROI? The nice thing is Assurant already had an amazing culture. That's like secret sauce, culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? And so Assurant has an amazing culture and has for a long time, and already had been focused in pockets on delivering really good experiences. So we were already starting from kind of a position of strength. So when I think about our transformation, when it comes to CX, it's really evolution, not revolution, right? We didn't need to burn anything to the ground.
Can I just say hallelujah? Because there's no transformation really in any of this sort of stuff. It's like it's not quantum physics. You don't go from kind of like here to here, and then it's like, ta-da, one and done. It's like, it's a continuous process. It's evolution rather than transformation.
That's right. And we just had to really kind of mature the good stuff we were already working with, right? And like I talked about, Assurant is an expert at reinvention. So we had already shifted before I joined from individual company verticals into kind of a shared services model about a year prior to me joining. So there was already a small CX team in place. They had been in place for about 7 years. They were doing a lot of process improvements and incremental CX enhancements. They were measuring customer satisfaction already. So to your point, the first thing we needed to do was just really build a solid and scalable foundation in terms of a system to listen and act on the voice of the customer. Right. A global system. 300 million customers is a lot of people to listen to. So we implemented an enterprise-wide platform to kind of take in, ingest, analyze, and visualize the customer feedback across multiple channels. And then we scaled it across the globe. To your point, there's the tactics of CX, and then there's the what I would call culture change or change management, scalability of CX, the foundational things. And so documenting what's our maturity across the organization, what's our target state, what do we need to do to mature across, and then what are those minor step changes that we need to do to enact that evolution, right? And to mature in small pockets. And so, that was what I did. Took an assessment of where are we? What are the pieces of work that are already in flight? What's the good stuff we're building from? What does it look like when we arrive? What's our North Star? If we get to this end state of, we're CX perfection, what would that look like? Build the vision, and then work backwards to identify the capabilities. We need to be able to systematically listen to, absorb, and act on customer feedback. We need to be able to design products and services from inception. We need to be able to facilitate seamless omni-channel experiences, right? And then within each line of business, because those products, the diversified products, are very distinct in terms of the customer journey and what the customers need. So I embedded practitioners in each line of business, and so that they could be experts, subject matter experts for that line of business, and they could set the roadmap along with the business leaders for each area, because it looks different for every area.
Yeah, no, that's the thing I was going to ask, was like because you mentioned that you would move to shared service models, and then I was going to ask was, by the sounds of it, it sounds like customer experience in Assurant has become almost like a shared service with embedded kind of like champions within each kind of business kind of line.
Hub and spoke is what I call it. Yes. Okay. So we have a community of practice. I lead the hub, and then we have spokes in each line of business.
Okay. No, that's that's kind of brilliant. I mean, because it's a different. Well, it's a way of working. Sometimes some people kind of. There's a big kind of conversation about where does it sit, where does it live, kind of does it have exec representation, kind of through who or directly, kind of all these different sort of things. So it's interesting to hear kind of how you guys have approached it. So, but the rubber hits the road in my mind when we start talking about outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
And you've kind of said that you've had, there was a team in place that was part of the whole move to the shared services model for like 7 years, and we're doing a bunch of incremental continuous improvement type stuff. Then you came in and started to go, okay, fine, we need to properly listen globally, and really embed that whole listen and understand and act and report kind of like cycle into the kind of business. So if outcomes where it's at, can you give us an idea, kind of the sort of things that you've achieved in the last year in terms of kind of outcomes?
Oh, how much time do we have again? No, I'm just kidding. It's right. Huge portfolio, right? 300 million customers. So I would say it's been a lot of work. It's been multifaceted, and it does look a little bit different, like I said, for each line of business. But to give a general idea, you talked about the voice of customer, right? You can put a platform in place, but then implementing the ways of working to actually do something about it, right? Okay, so you heard what your customers say. So what? What are you doing differently because of what they said, right? So I had to scale and train the CX staff, right? You have to kind of give them that, they have to get steeped in what are the different methodologies, what are the different disciplines. And you talked a little bit, I think, about maybe when we were talking earlier about this kind of dogmatic approach, right? And people, when they first learn a new skill, it's very by the book, right?
Yeah.
Like, this is a Kanban and I must go through these 7 steps in exactly this order, right? Instead of it being like, these are guidelines, and everything that our CX practitioners learn, it's a tool in their toolkit. Yeah. So when they go out to solve a business problem, they've got 12 tools. They can look and say, oh, okay, I'm going to pull, 3, 7, and 8 off the shelf. And that's what I'm going to use in this particular situation to solve this particular problem. Yeah. So I brought in learning and development content, made sure they were all up to speed on the latest kind of techniques, tools, human-centered design, process engineering, cost-benefit analysis, agile skill sets, right? They kind of needed to have all the technical skills so that they could know and practice when it comes to, am I reducing a touch point? Am I increasing digital containment, right? And then the change management. So making sure that our CX folks had a seat at the table, at every table they need to sit at in order to affect the building of great experiences. That's super important, because especially when it's a new discipline, people are used to working in one way and they're not used to listening to an independent in a shared services model, right? Somebody who doesn't necessarily report in that team, to say, hey, I'm going to challenge your thinking. I'm going to bring in a customer viewpoint. I'm going to ask you to think of things differently. But like I said, the culture at Assurant is fantastic. It's one of teamwork. It's one of collaboration. And most importantly, I would say our CEO made CX a strategic imperative. Okay. And so when you have that buy-in that says, like, this is something we as an organization are going to do, top down, bottom up, that really paves the way for success.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think the thing is, you're absolutely right. And I love the idea that it's like, it's not just about platforms and systems and data and analytics. All that stuff is good. And it's important, and it all helps. But actually, what I'm hearing you say is that actually it's about people, and it's about knowledge, and it's about capability. Yes. And it's about behavior and attitude.
Yes. And what do you do differently?
Yeah. And if you over-index on that, then you're probably not going to go far wrong.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So you asked about outcomes. A lot of that work has been on reducing touch points, because what's easier for the customer is better for both the customer and the business. Increasing digital pathways. Digital containment, right? Nobody likes to have to call, especially these days. I mean, you ask one of my kids to pick up a phone and call somebody, it's like, deer in the headlights look. And then smoothing out the omni-channel experiences, making sure that customers can interact with us not just in one channel, but in multiple channels, and that it's a seamless transition between those channels. And we've established NPS as our beacon metric. And we've seen that measure rise significantly in all our segments over time. So getting onto a consistent measure, as long as NPS is the appropriate measure. Right. I don't pretend that NPS is the end all be all and everybody should be measuring that and only that, but as something that's easily measured and easily benchmarked, and that you can see whether you're making progress over time. I think it's really good from that standpoint. And then we've made really great progress in ratings and reviews. We're over 4 stars in all the major consumer utilized ratings and reviews channels. So more so now than ever, consumers, before they make a purchasing decision or anything like that, they're going to go out. What do people say about this company?
Yeah.
And so if you're not proactively managing those channels, then you can look to the casual observer like you're not that competitive. So we've made great progress in improving those ratings as well. So
I mean that's absolutely right. I mean, you talked about warranty and insurance products and stuff, and I know that we recently changed our car, and we had to go through the whole signing of things. And I mean, it was all very smooth and great, and the people were great and things. And then it was all done digitally, with signing this and signing that. I'm still not quite adept at signing producing a representative kind of signature via touchpad on a laptop.
Right. Not the best customer experience, right?
Well, no, I think that's more to do with my own sort of dexterity more than else. It just looks like I'm regressing back to kind of what I would assign my name back in if I was like 4 or something. But what I wanted to do was, I recognize some of the stuff that you're kind of like talking about, but what I wanted to do was also ask you, because you said that you joined about 4 years ago. And actually 4 years ago, I'm like, wow, okay, fine. That's 2019, right?
Yeah.
And then the pandemic happened.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay, so how did everything change? Because you must have been like, oh, we're on this runway. And then.
Yep. Yeah, it was wild.
Things change, and then you're like, oh my God. And then you have to all recalibrate and things.
Yeah. I think it was jarring for everybody. Make no mistake, right? Everybody had to go like, this is a whole new world, and it's not going back to the world we knew. So, wow, what does this really mean for us? But what I will say about Assurant is that we were already very geographically dispersed when I joined the organization. We already had a footprint in 21 countries globally, and we were spread out in offices across the US. So for us, the shift to 100% work from home was relatively straightforward. I mean, I won't say easy, because I don't think it was easy for anybody. But we definitely didn't have the challenges that some companies who weren't already used to remote collaboration had. We were already very used to collaborating across time zones and using Zoom as a collaboration tool and things like that. We did shift to more, when travel got restricted, right? We shifted to more online methods of collaboration, whiteboard tools and things of that nature, right? Like a lot of people. And actually, as far as customer expectations, because that's the big thing, right? A lot of people in the industry say, well, I saw a decrease of face-to-face interactions and an increased desire for digital interactions. I would say we saw that to a certain extent, but again, as a B2B2C, we didn't have a ton of face-to-face interactions to begin with. We actually saw the desire for face-to-face channels increase during the pandemic. And largely that's because of the criticality of one of our lines of business. I mentioned cell phone insurance, right?
Right.
And all of a sudden, when people couldn't get together, FaceTime or video call was the only way to keep a connection with people's loved ones, right? Even sometimes, really heartbreakingly, loved ones in the hospital or experiencing their last days.
Sure.
So that phone became their lifeline. And if something happened to it, it needed to be fixed now, not 3 days in the mail back and forth. Now I need to go someplace. I need to have it fixed. I need to get it repaired immediately so that I can resume that call. Right. So our come to you options and in-store options and things like that actually gained prominence. For our workforce, it was a transition, but not the dramatic transition that it was for a lot of companies who were only used to in-person working. For our customers, it definitely shifted the ways that they interacted with us. But for my team in the CX practice at Assurant, we had to pivot, in some ways, like a lot of teams, but overall it wasn't, it certainly didn't derail us. We still were able to make really good progress.
Excellent. I mean, that's good news. I mean, it sounds like you kind of like you were pretty well set up to deal with kind of what landed in and around sort of like March 2020.
Yeah.
And then in the subsequent months. But that's the big and obvious challenge, as it were, if you can track back the last kind of 4 years. Have there been other sort of challenges that you've had to face along the way that have been maybe as if not more testing?
Sure. I mean, Fortune 300 company, right? So who doesn't face challenges? I would say the pressure from the ups and downs in the talent market, that was a big one. We went from talent shortage really and not being able to find people, or a big status quo during the pandemic. And then all of a sudden a shortage of talent. And then all of a sudden, wow, so many companies are laying off. Now there's kind of this glut of talent, right? Shifting customer expectations, turnaround times. They're expecting things now, right? Instead of so that's driven the need for greater staffing levels, even while automation of repetitive tasks has kind of reduced some of that manual workload, right? So use robotic process automation, artificial intelligence, machine learning, right? We take out the things that are super easy. But the stuff that's complex has gotten even more complex, and consumer pressure has increased for how quickly they expect to be responded to. So that's kept us challenged. I would say rising expenses and labor costs, combined with supply chain shortages. So for a significant portion of our business, things like in the auto realm, right? That's added a lot of customer kind of concern with price increases, long turnaround times. Like if their car used to get repaired in a week, now it's taking 2 to 3 weeks, right? So how are we meeting that need?
I guess that also kind of knocks on to like additional kind of operating costs as well, because if you've got a car that's in the shop getting repaired and you're waiting on spares and stuff, and then you've got to provide a courtesy car, and then that's kind of like, so it's a courtesy car for not for just a week or a few days, but it's a courtesy car for 2 or 3 weeks, then it's like there's a 3x rise, or potentially a 3x kind of rise in that operational cost.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And we're seeing that industry wide. I mean, you look at P&C insurers across the board. 2022 was a rough year, right? Again, with Assurant, we're so highly diversified, and a portion of our business is counter-cyclical. And we have, because of our B2B2C nature, we have a lot of levers we can pull. We actually weathered the storm better than most, which is great. But yeah, expenses are on the rise. I mean, there's just no getting around that, right? Internally, as far as the CX transformation, I would say there's always folks who don't necessarily understand the methodologies we're bringing to the table, or why we might lean on a certain tool, or have a different viewpoint on what customers are looking for. But that's kind of the magic of the messiness, right? At the end of the day, that collaboration, those conversations, that healthy challenge, that kind of makes us that much stronger throughout. So and it affects those better outcomes in the end.
And so you mentioned earlier on about being able to leverage artificial intelligence and machine learning and things. I mean, that's the rise in awareness about kind of the potential capability of these advanced technologies has just gone up exponentially over the last 6 months or so. But they're very sort of like future oriented. Some of the people are trying to apply them kind of now, but I think the things are only going to get better. So what's the outlook for the future for yourselves, and what do you think is going to be the impact of some of these new technologies going to be having on your operations? I mean, like, has the rise in generative AI particularly things like ChatGPT and things, has that fundamentally changed about your outlook for the future, or is it just more about, it might be able to accelerate things? How does that work?
The latter. I mean, I would say our future outlook is great. We have a high degree of confidence as an organization. But I mentioned the B2B2C aspect, right? We always want to be on the leading edge of adopting new ways of working so that we can be in front of it and be a thought leader when our clients look to us for solutions, right? We want to have already tested and learned that. We want to have already adopted it and actively looked for ways to use it. So again, I spoke about the culture as a great strength for Assurant. We're really agile. We're really scrappy. There's very much kind of this owner's mindset throughout the organization, and a real bias for action, right? Like, I'm going to lock arms with the person to the right and the left of me, and we're going to tackle that. We're going to go solve that, and we're going to look for ways to test that. So we will grab onto things like that. And we're really, again, I come back to the word purposeful. We look for ways and we say, so ChatGPT, right? We're very planful about, all right, what are the areas of our business, of our organization across our 300 million customers where we could leverage this to make things easier, to automate, to make the experience better, variety of business outcomes we're looking for to use it. Let's actively look for, say, 5 to 10 ways to test that out. And then we'll really quickly test it out, learn from what we need to learn, and then determine, what are the risks and controls we want to put around it so that, we're doing so in a prudent way, and then implement it so that it's institutionalized and we're skilled with utilizing it by the time our clients come to look for that. And that's the same with, we talked about robotic process automation, artificial intelligence, machine learning. AI and ML both, I would say, also really require a heavy human touch at the beginning of them and throughout their maturity to make sure they stay on track, right? Yeah. And you also have to make sure that you're putting the proper controls and guardrails around it to reduce things like unintentional bias, right? Or things that the negative side effects that could come out of those kinds of technologies. So we try to be really smart and prudent about how we explore them, but we do so really fast so that if our clients are asking about it, we already have experience with how to leverage it and how to get the most possible return out of it.
Perfect. Thank you. I mean, that's great. I mean, but then the other kind of area I wanted to ask about around this whole evolutionary program, kind of in brackets, transformation. Just so I'm going to tag it so then it shows up. People know what to listen to. That I think has probably been overlooked, in particularly the last kind of couple of years, is the strain that management and leadership has been under as they've tried to adapt to kind of new ways of working, kind of like new challenges and stuff. I mean, how have you had to change, you and your team, and how's the organization had to, as leaders, had to adapt to better and support and enable your team? Because that for me, there was this thing, particularly the onset of the pandemic. People were going, "Oh, look after your customers and look after your suppliers and everything else. Look after your people," and that was all very well and appropriate. But it made me wonder, who's looking after the people that's looking after the people?
Yeah, people leadership. I mean, it's the most critical layer in success for business, right? And I'll be honest, I mean, being fully remote was hard for me at first. I was at USAA for 18 years before I joined Assurant. And so I was so used to that in-person effectiveness, right? The hallway chats, the casual drive-by meetings. So it was a whole new ballgame to lead people across 9 states, 6 countries, the time zones, right? But 2 things. One, I was very purposeful about making sure that the paths for escalation or for expressing concerns and for, expressing your desires about your personal well-being were wide open, right? It's hard to have an open door policy when you don't have a door. But by continually putting it out into the world that, hey, these are your well-being resources. You need to take care of yourself first. The flight attendant analogy, right? Or the put on your own air mask before the person next to you. You can't be effective as a people leader if you're drowning. So you have to take care of you, and we have to train you and put you in possession of the proper tools to be a good leader, right? So continuous leadership development, focus on how are they showing up for their team. And then I got really strategic about planning out touch points that used to happen organically. Right. So virtual team builders, calendaring skip level meetings for every person in my organization. Make sure I was celebrating wins in emails or town hall recognition, right? Creating opportunities for them to highlight their work across multiple channels. It started out kind of feeling forced, but the more we did it, the better it worked. And I think just that mentality of looking after the holistic person, you spend X number of hours at work, but you're a whole entire person outside of work. So how are you taking care of that person? And are you leveraging all the resources we're providing to take care of that person? And then how are you then turning around and showing up for your team and enabling them to do this?
Yeah. So I think you said something there that I think is really interesting, which is this idea it turned out initially to feel slightly forced.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's fascinating because it speaks to the building of habits. And how when you build a new habit or you're trying to start a new thing and become this kind of thing where it's either, I don't know, you take on a new kind of like exercise regime or you start running or whatever, and you start out and you're like going, you've not run for a while and you're a bit like, and it all feels slightly mechanical type thing. Or you're going to get up early or whatever, and it all feels slightly forced, as you say, because you're learning a new skill.
Yep.
And it's all by the numbers. It's a bit like when you learn to drive a car, let's say. And after you've passed your driving test and you've got your kind of like your license and things, and then it's a bit like, okay, I remember in the UK there's this thing where they talk about, it's like they go like mirror, signal, maneuver, and that's the kind of thing that goes through your head. Or it's when you're crossing the road, it's like going look both ways, kind of like, and do all the kind of things. And that's just the thing that you get into. And I think, but what I think is an interesting point you make, because, and it's an important one, because many people won't stick with something because it feels forced or slightly uncomfortable or slightly unnatural to start with. And so they'll go and they'll show up and they'll try and be this more, I don't know, less directive and more kind of like, I'm going to lean into this and listen and try and understand and draw out different opinions from people. And it can feel a bit slightly mechanical and it feels slightly uncomfortable. But actually that might not just be about anybody else, but just them. Yes. And actually they'll step away from it because it does feel comfortable. They actually need to kind of stick with it because until it sticks and it forms and it becomes part of kind of just your rhythm and what you do. But also that you also demonstrate that it matters and it's important.
Yes.
And then people are there to, if you do it with the right sort of intent, then you'll just get better at it. But then again, I guess that's the point back to your purposeful.
Actually, if they can see that it's forced and you're doing it anyway, it kind of illustrates how seriously you're taking it.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And eventually it does become autopilot. But even if you don't get it right the first time out of the gate, they see the effort. They see that it's important to you. They see that it's important that, you're building that social capital as a team. And that that's what makes us able to work together cohesively and smoothly versus always the risk of an environment that started out as an emergency and became the status quo is that you have an environment where you're always in a storming, right? Whole forming, storming, norming, right? You don't want to be in perpetual storming. You want to hit norming and performing. And you can't do that unless you kind of put in those touch points that help you get there.
Yeah. So zooming out a little bit, I just wanted to kind of ask you, because a lot of people are going through these their own sort of programs in organizations that they work for. So what are some of the key learnings, top tips that you can share with us that would maybe kind of help others on their own journey?
Yeah. Deb's top tips for building a COE, right? I would say, first and foremost, you have to document the case for change. So why, what's people's reason to believe, right? Why are we even taking this on in the first place? You talked about it, clearly define the scope of work, identify and communicate with your stakeholders, figure out how to identify the top issues to tackle, right? If you're just arbitrarily picking something and going, well, that seems like a pain point, there has to be a more systematic way. Leverage the creative brainstorming when it comes to ideation, leverage the power of the people that you have in place, prioritize ruthlessly. So do not waste resources chasing low return efforts. I think, again, people chase a quick win and it's like, yeah, but if that's all you ever do, then where's the evolution? Are you actually raising the bar? Assess and train your talent, define metrics for success. And then, we touched on this in the question before, but have fun. Life is too short. We spend way too many hours at work for it not to be fun. I tell my folks all the time, especially if they're stressing out about something, this is insurance, not Congress. Like it's going to be okay, right? We're here to affect change and make a difference, but at the end of the day, it's not like, it's not life and death. It's going to be all right, and there's very little you can do that we can't fix if you make a mistake.
Yeah, I think the one thing I would go back to kind of and say that is you talk about make the case for change, and the one thing I learned comes more than 20 years or so ago when I worked for a big corporate, and we were doing a lot of the new business development, new initiatives, sort of building those kind of cases as business cases. And the company had a process for that. It was a very well-defined process for that. But one of the things I learned from some colleagues I was working with, and they were more familiar, they were like dyed-in-the-wool sort of corporate sort of folks. I was reasonably new to the big corporate space. They said the idea of like socializing your case for change. Now, and what they mean by that is the idea is like if you go into like an XCOM kind of meeting and you're pitching for support, you should have socialized that kind of that business plan or that case for change enough that it's not a surprise to anybody.
Correct.
And that you should go in expecting the answer before you go in, unless you get sideswiped by something that's happened like 24 hours or 48 hours kind of since you last talked to somebody. And I don't know if people do that as much, but I think it's a really important kind of bit because it requires you to take and expend time up front rather than just let's go and let's get started. It's like, no, realize you live within a social organism. And it's about building those connections and doing that advocacy and that socialization and things. And so I'm sure that probably has to work within Assurant too, because you're such a diverse portfolio of business lines. I mean, walking something around the business in inverted commas.
That shared services model, right? Yeah. When you're a centralized function and you're trying to move the needle within multiple lines of business. Yeah, I have a lot of stakeholders. And yes, it does. I don't want to say it slows you down because as long as you're purposeful, you've accounted for the time that's going to take. That's part of the work. That's the work of the work. The problem is some people think, well, the work is this and that's extra. No, helping people get there is the work. It's part of the work. And I was really, really lucky when I first came in. My boss at the time, she said to me, I don't want you to deliver a single thing for the first 3 months. I want you to get around to the whole company. I want you to meet everybody you need to meet. I want you to build relationships. I want you to understand their business, and I want you to understand their priorities and the metrics to which they're being held accountable before we build the plan for enterprise CX. And at the time, I was a little bit taken aback, right? I was like, oh my gosh, that seems like such a long time. But she knew the company inside and out. And she knew that is the most critical piece to success is getting everybody on board with understanding, why are we changing? What does it mean for them? How do we see it changing? And what is that evolution, right? And that time to build relationships and have them see my vision and have me see their priorities and their vision for their organizations was super critical to set the foundation for success. Yeah. And not a lot of leaders, frankly, have the patience to let that play out, right? But that's why I say when you ask about Assurance outlook, we are the culture here is so rock steady that like we're playing the long game, right? We're always setting ourselves up for future success, which sometimes means near-term investment.
Yeah. And that sometimes requires kind of like time. And it's almost saying that as well, it seems to me that it's not that you're not just applying an agile mindset to product development. but you're applying an agile mindset to the whole thing. We'll create something, we'll go and speak to somebody, we'll take their feedback, we'll iterate, kind of do it, and we'll go out again, and we'll kind of keep going. So everything is iterative. Even the proposal that you create or the case for change is it's not an MVP, but it's a proposal, right? And then it will be subject to change all of the time.
And I guess so maybe that's another top tip, because you can't have a lot of pride of ownership in CX.
There you go.
You can't say, this is my idea and I think it's the best thing since sliced bread, and this is what I think you need to do in your business, and I'm going to hold to it with like my claws sunk into it, right? It has to be very much, this is my suggestion, this is my idea, this is what I see from my independent point of view. How do you see it? Let's change it and morph it together, because it's the synergy of those two viewpoints coming together that makes it into something better that neither of us could have thought of alone.
Absolutely. Perfect. So that's brilliant. I love that kind of like relinquish pride of ownership. Check your ego at the door.
Exactly.
So congratulations on all the success today, but I just wanted to kind of, before I ask you a couple of wrap-up questions, is there anything else that you'd like to add or highlight that we've kind of like missed out about your whole kind of journey? I mean, anything?
The only thing I might add, because we didn't hit too much on human-centered design and design thinking as kind of that tool. We talked about the toolkit and giving them a lot of things, but when we think about what is kind of that secret weapon that all CX practitioners should be using and utilizing, it's one of those things that, because it's a way of thinking and a way of doing business, that it can be kind of this invisible power booster. Once they learn it, they can't unlearn it, and they spread that way of learning across the organization. And so when you create like a center of excellence where people are rotating in and rotating out and cross-pollinating in the talent across the organization, if you're using human-centered design and design thinking regularly, and you're germinating that throughout the organization, then it really becomes very powerful, because it shifts the way that the organization thinks. And I just think that it's something that a lot of people don't necessarily go out and formally study or add to their toolkit in terms of a way of doing things that is really powerful if they do.
Yeah, again, that's another thing that requires kind of like time, and it's something that I've talked about kind of a lot before. Is like get away from the data and get away from the spreadsheets and the kind of the fancy charts and stuff, and try and get it, either experience it for yourself or get into other people's kind of lives, get into kind of understanding kind of what the things that they go through, and because you got to get past this thing that's called like the curse of expert knowledge. You know, just because you built it and you think it looks simple, it's like,
it's not.
It's not always the case. And so you have to be able to bring kind of like, to almost adopt that kind of beginner's mind and be able to see things from other people's perspective. And so, yeah, it's a great advice. So if I brought, I mean, I'm just conscious of time kind of here, but if I was actually to kind of boil it down, it's like, it's always a bit like, complete this sentence. Deb says, ... And what would be your best advice to someone listening in that wants to improve their customer and also their employee experience? Because it's this kind of it's this holistic, integrated sort of thing. What would be your best advice? Well, if you were to boil it down to one or two things, what would they be?
Just one or two things. I would say, not all experiences are created equal. You kind of have to understand where they fall on the spectrum before you start designing them, right? And the spectrum I usually use is complexity versus emotion. How hard is this thing to do, and how emotionally laden is it to do? Stuff that's low and low, you can automate. Stuff that's high and high, you have to give a white glove approach to, right? So understand where your experience falls on the spectrum of experiences before you start designing it. And then, I mean, the last thing I would say is experience management. I always say is expectation management. Have to either determine what the customer's expectation is, or set the expectation for them, and then make sure that the experience is meeting or exceeding it. Because if they expect it to be easy and it's easy, great. If they expect it to be hard and it's hard, like authentication, right? They know they're going to have to do 2 steps. Everybody expects that, and that's fine. It's when they expect it to be easy and it's actually hard that you run into problems. So if you're going to design an experience, you need to understand what the customer expectation is and then make sure that the lived expectation is meeting or exceeding that.
Excellent. Great advice. Thank you. And I love the complexity and emotion sort of like kind of matrix. That's really useful. So Deb, a couple of questions before we go. And the first one is around the whole punk concepts that I've been talking about on the podcast for a while now. And two questions within that. So first one, this is a challenge now for you to come up with a unique word or couple of words that describe from your perspective, a more punk approach to customer experience. I warn you, I have collected 184 of these so far. So it's not an easy shot. But so what one or two words would you use to describe a more punk approach to customer experience?
Well, I looked up the definition of punk, and it is a loud, fast-moving, and aggressive form of rock music. That's the like Webster's dictionary. I don't normally think of a CX as aggressive, but we can definitely be fast-moving, and we often have to be loud to be heard. So for me, that one word would be gritty. And I don't know if that's already on your list, but I think you have to show a lot of grit, a lot of resilience, a lot of determination. You have to be able to get your hands dirty.
Grit's already there.
Okay. All right. So then my backup is not boring. It's not boring. You have to remain interested. You have to not get bored. You have to be able to...
It shoots. She scores.
Woohoo!
Not boring. Like it. I mean, gritty is technically not on there, but grit as in resilience is on there. So not boring is definitely not on the list. Actually, and it's a couple of words that I've used to describe. I use in the book as well, and it's actually interesting and surprising that it's actually not already on the list. But anyway, so you're number 185
every day.
Yeah, absolutely brilliant. So that's great. So thank you. Then the next one is, by extension, I was talking about this idea, Punk XL came along, and it was this idea that experience leadership is something we need to talk about because it's a more holistic, integrated, systemic approach to experience, and it's a multidimensional thing. So what sort of company or brand do you think is like an experienced leader, and why?
And you've probably heard this one multiple times, but it's because it's the gold standard, right? And for me, it'll always be Disney, so much so that they have a leadership academy around it, right? The amount of thought, design, planning, creativity that goes into the experiences they create. I mean, it's mind-blowing, right? From calculating how many steps it takes you to get from the place of purchase to the trash to dispose of the wrappings, to their consideration for less abled guests. Like it's just incredible. The amount of investment they've made in making sure that experience is not just good, but delightful. They've made it into an art form that just so many people try to emulate. So
excellent. Thank you. And so one final one,
yes,
if I may, and this is something I read added recently, is because the world's an interesting place right now. It's a bit weird. A lot of the time it's quite dark. And every morning I find myself kind of looking, oh my God. And oh my God. And so what I thought I'd try to do is add a bit of a good news story on the end of these podcasts. So I wanted to, before we wrap up, I wanted to ask you, what's the most interesting, positive, exciting thing that you've seen in the last, or the thing that's made you smile that you've seen in the last kind of week? What would that be?
I saw a headline this last week that did make me smile. And it was that the governor of Minnesota signed a bill dedicating a 7-mile stretch of highway after Prince. It's now the Prince Rogers Nelson Memorial Highway. And what makes it interesting is he signed it in purple ink.
Oh, that's tremendous. I tell you what, I'm going to tell my wife that, because she is like the biggest Prince fan.
Yep. He's from Minnesota. Who knew?
Yeah. And so that's brilliant. I love that. So what a great story to finish on. I'll message kind of Hannah now and tell her. So Deb, that's it. That's all I have for today. I just want to say thank you. Well, first of all, congratulations on the success that Assurant is having, and the success of your kind of team and the program that you've built and you're running. now. And also wanted to say thank you for sharing your time and your insight with us today. That's been awesome.
Absolutely. It's my favorite topic. Thanks for spending the time with me, and thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. Wow, what a great interview. I hope you enjoyed it. I know I did. Find out more about me and the work that I do at adrianswinscoe.com. Do leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. And if you have any comments, feedback, or questions about the podcast, then feel free to send me a message to podcast@adrianswinscoe.com. And do tune in again. Thanks very much.